The supper table had never felt so small. Joseph Turner sat at the head of it, his jaw tight as iron, his dark eyes fixed on the woman who had arrived not 3 hours ago on the afternoon stage from Kansas City, and who was now sitting directly across from him, with the calm, unflinching gaze of someone who absolutely refused to be intimidated. The candlelight moved across her face in warm amber waves, and his ranch foreman, old Pete Caldwell, had already knocked over his water glass twice because he could not stop staring at her either. Joseph had not smiled at a Sunday supper in 4 years. Not once. Not when the harvest was good, not when the cattle prices climbed, not when his neighbors toasted his name at the Stockmen's Association dinner in Abilene. The smile had died with his wife, Clara, in the winter of 1879, and he had buried it right alongside her in the frozen Kansas earth, and he had never expected it to return. But Wilhelmina Monroe looked up from her plate, met his eyes across the biscuits and the gravy and the roasted corn, and said with complete serenity, "Mr. Turner, you are staring at me as though I have grown a second head, and I assure you I have not." And Joseph Turner smiled. It was small. It was involuntary. It was gone almost before it arrived, swallowed back like something shameful. But Pete Caldwell saw it. The young ranch hand named Dick saw it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Abrams, nearly dropped the coffee pot. And Wilhelmina Monroe saw it too, though she only returned her attention to her supper with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned long ago that the world revealed itself most honestly when it thought it wasn't being watched. Joseph pressed his thumb against the edge of the table until the knuckle went white. He did not understand what had just happened to him. And for a man who had spent 4 years building his entire identity around understanding everything around controlling every acre of his 8,000-acre ranch, every dollar in his ledger, every head of cattle on his land, that terrifying lack of understanding felt like the ground had tilted 12 degrees beneath his boots. He reached for his coffee and said nothing at all. It had started, as most impossible things start, with a letter. 3 weeks before that Sunday supper, on a cold gray Thursday morning in October of 1883, Joseph Turner had been standing in his study in the ranch house outside of Caldwell, Kansas, reading correspondence he had not requested and did not want. His attorney in Wichita, a man named Gerald Foss, had written to inform him that the estate of Monroe Agricultural Supply, a mid-sized operation out of St. Louis, had gone into receivership following the death of its owner, one Harold Monroe, and that Mr. Monroe's surviving daughter had sent inquiries to several cattlemen in the region about possible employment as a bookkeeper or household manager. Gerald Foss had included the young woman's letter of inquiry. Joseph had almost thrown it directly into the fire. He had not thrown it into the fire. He had read it 3 times. The letter was written in a hand so precise and confident it almost looked typeset. Wilhelmina Monroe had introduced herself with no excess sentiment and no false humility. She was 26 years old. She held a certificate from the St. Louis Ladies' Commercial College in accounting and business correspondence. She had managed her father's supply company books for 4 years before his death. She had no living family in the state of Missouri and limited prospects in a city that had no interest in unmarried women who wanted to work rather than to marry. She was not, she had made clear in very plain language, writing to inquire about marriage. She was writing to inquire about a job. She could manage accounts, household supply records, correspondence, and grain inventory. She could also, she noted at the close of the letter without elaboration, shoot a rifle with reasonable accuracy, though she did not anticipate that skill would be professionally relevant. Joseph had stood in his study for a long time after reading that letter. His ranch needed a bookkeeper. His previous man of accounts, a fellow from Wichita named Harlan Grove, had left abruptly in August after a dispute over wages, and Joseph had been keeping his own ledgers ever since, which was wearing on him. The ranch employed 14 hands, managed a herd of nearly 3,000 longhorns, and ran seasonal contracts with 2 railroad buyers. It was a serious financial operation, and it needed serious management. He had hired women before. Mrs. Abrams had kept his household running for 3 years. He was not opposed to it on principle. What had made him hesitate? And he told himself it was only hesitation. Nothing more complex than that was the letter itself. Something in the directness of it. Something in the way she had refused to perform vulnerability even while describing a genuinely desperate situation. He had read letters from desperate people before. They usually sounded desperate. Wilhelmina Monroe's letter sounded like a business proposition from someone who happened to have had a bad year. He had written back offering her a position. He had kept the offer professional, outlining the duties, the wage $30 a month, which was fair, and the living arrangements, which would be a private room in the main house with full board. He had not mentioned that he was a widower. He had not mentioned the nature of the ranch beyond its size and location. He had sent the letter off with the Tuesday Post rider and told himself it was a practical decision made for practical reasons. She had accepted by return post within the week. And now it was the first Sunday of November, 1883, and Wilhelmina Monroe was sitting across from him at his supper table with candlelight in her dark brown hair. And Joseph Turner had smiled for the first time in 4 years, and he absolutely could not account for it. After supper, while Mrs. Abrams cleared the dishes and Pete Caldwell excused himself with transparent haste to go check on the horses, which did not need checking, Wilhelmina stood in the hallway outside the dining room and examined the framed survey maps of the ranch that hung on the wall. She studied them with real attention, tracing the property lines with her eyes, not touching the glass. Joseph came out of the dining room behind her and stopped when he saw what she was doing. "The north pasture," she said, without turning around, "is significantly larger than the others. Are you running separate herds there or just rotating the grazing?" He blinked. "Rotating. We move the main herd through the north section in the late fall to let the south pasture rest over winter." She nodded slowly. "That would account for the feed cost differential I noticed in the quarterly summary you included with your letter. The hay purchases spike in January because you're supplementing the north pasture after the rotation pulls the grass down." He had included a quarterly financial summary in his second letter, a brief one, to let her assess the scope of the bookkeeping work. He had not expected her to analyze it during a 20-hour stagecoach ride and arrive having already identified his operational patterns. "Yes," he said, because there was nothing else to say. "That's correct." She turned then and looked at him. She was not small, perhaps 5 feet and 5 inches, with a straight-backed posture that suggested she had been told to stand straight so many times as a girl that she had simply internalized it as natural. Her eyes were a medium brown, intelligent and alert, set in a face that was plain by the formal standards of fashion magazines, but that had a quality of honesty to it, a quality of being exactly what it appeared to be, that Joseph found disquieting because he had not been expecting it. "I would like to review the full year's ledgers tomorrow, if that would be acceptable," she said. "The ledgers will be in the study," he said. "I'll have them out for you." "Thank you." She paused for a moment and something flickered across her face, the first hesitation he had seen from her. "Mr. Turner, I want you to know that I understand the nature of this arrangement may seem unusual to some of your neighbors, a woman in this position. I have no intention of causing you any professional embarrassment or social complication." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Monroe, I hired you because you are qualified. What my neighbors think is their own business, and I've never been especially interested in managing their opinions." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "That is a quality I respect," she said, and then she said good night and went upstairs to the room Mrs. Abrams had prepared for her, and Joseph stood alone in the hallway looking at his survey maps and not seeing them at all. The next morning arrived hard and cold with a wind that came off the plains like a moving wall. Joseph was up at 4:30, as he always was, out with the hands at first light for the morning check of the south herd. The longhorns were restless in the cold, moving in tight clusters near the creek line, their breath making small clouds in the gray air. Dix, the young hand who was maybe 19 and enthusiastic about everything, rode up beside Joseph with the morning count and reported 2 animals separated from the herd and found near the fence line at the east property border. "Whose property is that fence line adjacent to?" Joseph asked, though he already knew. Dix looked slightly uncomfortable. "Garrison's land, sir." Raymond Garrison was the other large cattleman in the county. He ran a ranch nearly as large as Joseph's, and he ran it with a certain philosophy that Joseph had spent 3 years quietly opposed to, a philosophy that involved, among other things, persistent pressure on the smaller homesteaders in the region to sell their land, a preference for range tactics that Joseph considered predatory, and an ongoing low-level campaign to establish himself as the dominant cattle interest between Caldwell and the border. He was not a violent man exactly, but he was an aggressive one, and the two of them had maintained a relationship of careful, formal hostility that neither had yet broken openly. The 2 separated longhorns were his animals, not Garrison's. He collected them himself and rode the fence line for a mile before heading back. The fence was intact. The animals had simply found a gap in the brush near the corner post. It was a minor thing, but he was aware, as he rode back to the ranch house, that Garrison's men had been spotted on the county road 3 times in the past week, which was more than usual. When he came back through the kitchen door, Wilhelmina was already in his study. The door was open, and she was seated at the secondary desk he had placed in the corner for the purpose, with the ledger books open in front of her, a fresh pot of coffee on the corner of the desk that Mrs. Abrams must have brought her, and a small leather notebook in which she was making careful notations in her precise, confident hand. She looked up when he knocked on the door frame. "Good morning. Mrs. Abrams told me you go out early. I hope I haven't disturbed anything by starting without you." "That's what I hired you for," he said. He hung his coat and hat on the rack by the door and crossed to the larger desk, which was his working space, and began going through the morning correspondence. "How does it look?" There was a brief pause. "Honestly," he glanced at her, "always." "It is workable," she said, in the tone of a person carefully selecting the most tactful, accurate word. "The accounts are not in disorder exactly, but they lack consistency. Your previous bookkeeper used 3 different systems at different points in the year, and the transition periods create gaps that are difficult to reconcile without the original purchase receipts. I'm going to need those. They're in the box on the bottom shelf. I found them. About 1/3 of them are missing." He set down the letter he had been reading. "Missing. Not catastrophically missing. The core account figures are recoverable through the bank statements." She set her pen down and folded her hands on the desk. "Mr. Turner, I have to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Did your previous bookkeeper leave voluntarily?" He looked at her. "Harlan Grove, he left in August. I said his departure was a dispute over wages." "And was it?" The silence that followed was not comfortable, but Wilhelmina Monroe seemed entirely comfortable with uncomfortable silences, which was unusual. Most people tried to fill them. "Partially," Joseph said finally. "He also had certain habits that I was not willing to accommodate indefinitely. He had an arrangement with a supplier in Wichita that I believe involved a private incentive for steering our purchase orders in a particular direction." Her expression did not change significantly. "Kickbacks. I never proved it formally." "But you believe it." "I believe it," he confirmed. She picked up her pen again. "That would account for the inflated supply costs in the second and third quarter. I'll note it as a flag and work through the supplier invoices this week." She said it as though it were simply one more item on a list without any performance of outrage or drama, and Joseph found himself thinking that she was, in fact, exactly as competent as her letter had suggested. "Miss Monroe," he said. She looked up. "Welcome to Turner Ranch," he said, and this time the corner of her mouth moved further than it had the night before. It was a real smile, small and self-possessed, but entirely real. The first week of November settled into a working rhythm that Joseph found, to his own surprise, not uncomfortable. Wilhelmina kept to the study for most of the morning hours, working through the ledgers with a methodical patience that he could hear even from across the house. The quiet scratch of her pen, the soft thump of a ledger being closed and another opened, the occasional sound of the desk drawer when she needed a fresh sheet of paper. She joined him for meals, as her arrangement specified she would, taking her meals with the household rather than in her room. She was not a talkative person at meals, but she was an attentive listener. She heard everything. Joseph began to notice this quality in her, the way she absorbed information from conversations without appearing to be actively collecting it. She was not calculating about it. It was simply a deep habit of attention, the kind that develops in people who have spent years navigating rooms where they were not automatically heard. He learned things about her in small fragments. He learned that her father's death had been a heart episode, sudden, without warning, in the middle of a working day. He learned that the receivership of the supply company had left her, with essentially nothing after the creditors were settled. He learned that she had younger cousins in Cincinnati whom she corresponded with but could not rely upon for support. He learned that she had wanted to study law, once, before understanding that no law school in Missouri would accept a woman. She learned things about him, too. He could tell by the careful way she sometimes didn't ask about things. The portrait of Clara that hung in the parlor, which she had noticed on the first day and had never mentioned. The way he went quiet sometimes at supper for no apparent external reason. The small rituals of avoidance he had built around the Sunday meal in particular. The way he had systematically eliminated every element of Sunday supper that had been Clara's particular touch. The good china, the candles, the tablecloth that Clara had embroidered herself. Mrs. Abrams had put the candles back when Wilhelmina arrived. She had brought out the good china for Sunday. She had done it quietly, making no comment, the way a housekeeper who has worked for someone for 3 years knows how to reintroduce necessary things without appearing to force a confrontation. And Joseph, in the event, had sat down and had supper and had involuntarily smiled for the first time in 4 years, and he was still not prepared to examine that too closely. The complication arrived on a Thursday morning in the second week of November, and it arrived in the form of Raymond Garrison. Garrison came himself, which was unusual. He normally communicated through intermediaries or through his trail boss, a man named Colquitt. But on this particular cold, bright morning, he rode up to the main gate of Turner Ranch with 2 riders behind him, and dismounted with the ease of a man who considered himself welcome everywhere by default. Joseph met him on the porch. Garrison was perhaps 50, heavy-shouldered, with a white mustache and the deeply weathered complexion of a man who had spent 30 years outdoors. He was not physically threatening in any specific way, but he carried himself with the settled authority of someone who had spent those 30 years winning. And there was something in that, in the long habituation to success, that made him more dangerous than a man with a gun. "Turner," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both civil and condescending. "Came to have a conversation." "Garrison." Joseph did not invite him inside. "What's on your mind?" Garrison's gaze moved across the house front and then, with the controlled casualness of a man who was looking for exactly what he was looking for, settled on the window of the study, where Wilhelmina's small figure was briefly visible before she stepped back from the glass. "Heard you had a new arrangement at the ranch," Garrison said. "A bookkeeper," Joseph said. His voice was flat. "Miss Monroe is managing my accounts. Is that what you rode out here to discuss?" Garrison looked back at him. Something behind his eyes was assessing, calculating. "Not exactly. I came to discuss the Hatcher homestead." The Hatcher homestead was a small property, perhaps 300 acres, situated on the south side of the county road between Turner's land and Garrison's. James Hatcher was a dry land farmer with a wife, 3 children, and a modest operation that had survived 3 hard years on determination alone. He was the kind of small settler that Garrison had been methodically pressuring throughout the county. "What about it?" Joseph said. "Hatcher's in a difficult position," Garrison said, with the practiced sympathy of a man who had arranged for the position to be difficult. "His water access from Plum Creek has been interrupted fence dispute with the property to his north. He's having trouble making his fall payment to the land office." He paused. "I've made him a fair offer." "Have you?" Joseph said. 300 acres at $8 an acre," Garrison said. "That's a fair price for dry land." It was not a fair price. It was approximately 60% of fair market value, offered to a man who was under enough pressure that he might take it. Joseph knew this, and Garrison knew that he knew it. "I'm not sure what this has to do with me," Joseph said. "I want to expand my south line," Garrison said. "If I take the Hatcher property, the boundary runs adjacent to your east fence. I wanted to discuss the arrangement before proceeding. Professional courtesy." It was not professional courtesy. It was a notification, and a subtle one, a way of establishing that what Garrison did was beyond Joseph's influence. What it was, in plain language, was a message. "I appreciate you making the ride," Joseph said. "Good day to you, Garrison." Garrison held his gaze for a moment, then smiled with his teeth and mounted his horse. He rode back down the lane without hurrying. Joseph stood on the porch for a long moment after the sound of hooves faded. He was aware that the study window was occupied again. He went inside. Wilhelmina was standing at the window when he came into the study, not looking at the retreating riders but at the wide, flat landscape beyond the fence. She turned when he entered. "I heard some of that," she said. She did not apologize for it. "Garrison wants the Hatcher land," Joseph said. "And James Hatcher doesn't want to sell it," she said. "Not a question. Almost certainly not." He moved to his desk and sat down, looking at nothing in particular. "But if Garrison has engineered the water access problem, and it sounds like something he would do, Hatcher may not have a choice." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's the water access problem specifically? You said a fence dispute." "Someone's run a fence across the north access to Plum Creek. Hatcher's been using that crossing for 3 years by informal arrangement with the property to his north, which is a small holding owned by a man named Draper who has been ill recently." She returned to her desk and sat down, and Joseph noticed that she was turning this over in her mind in the way she turned ledger problems over, not emotionally, but constructively, looking for the load-bearing point. "If the fence is on Draper's land," she said, "and Draper is ill and unable to manage his own property, who has been making decisions on his behalf," Joseph looked at her. "I don't know." "That would be worth knowing," she said quietly. He stared at her for another moment, and then he reached for his coat. He had a call to make. What Joseph discovered over the next 2 days, riding out to speak with James Hatcher, and then tracking down a bedridden Arthur Draper at his son's house in Caldwell, confirmed what the turn of Wilhelmina's mind had already suggested. The fence on Draper's north access strip had been erected by a crew that Draper's son, a young man named Miles who was distracted with his father's illness, had allowed onto the property on the representation that they were conducting a county survey. Miles Draper had not read the documents he signed. The documents, which a lawyer in Wichita had drawn up on behalf of an unnamed land interest, authorized the fence construction under the guise of property line clarification. The unnamed land interest was, without much effort, traceable to a holding company that Garrison had filed 2 years earlier through a different attorney. Joseph sat in his study the evening of the second day and told Wilhelmina what he had found, laying it out point by point, and she listened with her elbows on the desk and her hands folded under her chin. "He built a legal mechanism to cut off the water access," she said when he finished. "The fence is technically lawful because Draper's son signed documents he didn't understand, and with that fence in place, Hatcher can't water his animals adequately, which makes his fall payment impossible, which forces the sale." "Yes," Joseph said. "Is there a lawyer in the county who could challenge the documents?" "The county attorney is Harold Greer. He's competent, but he's overextended. The nearest circuit judge passes through Caldwell in December, which is 6 weeks away." He looked at her. "Hatcher doesn't have 6 weeks if his payment is due to the land office." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "When is his payment due?" "End of November. 3 weeks." "Yes." She picked up her pen. "I need to see the county land office records for the Draper property, and I need to see the articles of incorporation for Garrison's holding company if they're filed with the county clerk. Can you get me those?" He looked at her. "Probably within a day or two." "Why?" "Because I learned something from 4 years of accounting for a supply company," she said, not looking up from the paper she was beginning to mark. "Financial arrangements always have a weak joint somewhere. A document that was filed in the wrong order, a registration that didn't comply with the territory statute, a date that doesn't line up with the claimed timeline." She looked up then, and her eyes were sharp and focused. Garrison used legal mechanisms. Legal mechanisms can have errors. It was the second time since her arrival that Joseph Turner felt the ground tilt under him, and this time he was not even sure whether it was the quality of her mind or something else entirely that caused it. "All right," he said. "I'll ride to the county clerk's office in the morning." The records took 2 days to obtain. They were voluminous land office filings, incorporation documents, survey records, and Wilhelmina spread them across the study floor in what appeared to be disorder, but was in fact a very specific organizational system that Joseph, watching from the doorway, gradually began to understand. "Here," she said on the second evening, sitting cross-legged on the study floor surrounded by papers, pointing to a document without looking up. "The holding company's registration with the county clerk is dated September 4th, 1882. But the fence construction documents that Miles Draper signed are dated August 19th, 1882. The company authorized to conduct that survey and construct that fence didn't legally exist yet when those documents were executed." Joseph crouched down next to the papers. He looked at the dates. He looked at them again. "The authorization predates the company," he said. "By 16 days, she said. "Which means the documents Miles Draper signed were executed in the name of a company that had not yet been registered. Under Kansas territorial law, a contract executed in the name of a non-existent entity is void." She looked at him. "The fence is illegal. The authorization for it is invalid. Which means the fence should never have been permitted to stand, and Hatcher's water access is still legally intact." The silence in the study was complete. "How did you see that?" Joseph said. She looked at him steadily. "Because I have spent 4 years looking for the place where the numbers don't agree," she said. "People who build dishonest structures always miss something. They're too focused on the outcome to be careful about every step of the process." A pause. Garrison was confident. He didn't expect anyone to look. Joseph was looking at her in the lamplight and feeling something that had been carefully locked away in a room he had sealed in the winter of 1879, and he was aware of it, and he was aware that it frightened him, and he stood up and said, "I'll take this to Harold Greer tomorrow morning." "Take copies," she said. "Keep the originals here." "Agreed," he said. He was at the door when she said, "Mr. Turner." He turned. "James Hatcher has a family," she said quietly. "Children. I know that's not strictly my concern as a bookkeeper." "It's your concern," he said, "as a person." And then he went out before he could say anything else. Harold Greer, the county attorney, was a thin, methodical man who read Wilhelmina's analysis of the documents with the careful pace of someone who was checking each step against his mental catalog of territorial statute. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and was silent for 30 seconds. "She's right," he said finally. "The authorization is void. The fence has no legal standing." "What does that mean for Hatcher?" Joseph asked. "It means I can send a formal notice to Garrison's holding company requiring the fence removal within 10 days, or I seek a court order. Garrison will almost certainly not push this to court challenge. The legal exposure is significant, and his attorney, whoever drafted those incorporation documents, was sloppy." Greer looked at him with something that was not quite admiration but was adjacent to it. Where did you find someone who could read a land filing like that? She applied by letter, Joseph said. He rode home in the cold afternoon light feeling something he had almost forgotten the shape of. It was not happiness exactly, not yet. It was more like the first sensation of a limb waking after long numbness. It was uncomfortable and it was real, and he rode through it the way you ride through a change in the weather, unable to alter it, only able to move forward. The fence came down 10 days later. James Hatcher made his land payment on November 28th with 5 days to spare. Garrison said nothing publicly. He did not need to. Everyone in the county understood what had happened. Raymond Garrison had built a trap and someone had found the flaw in it, and the trap had come apart before he could close it, and the someone was the new bookkeeper at Turner Ranch, a woman from St. Louis who had been in the county for less than 3 weeks. Joseph heard, through Pete Caldwell who heard it from the feed store, that Garrison had made a remark about meddling outsiders. He also heard, through the same channel, that 3 of the smaller homesteaders in the south part of the county had made a point of calling at Turner Ranch to leave their thanks. Wilhelmina received each of them at the door with the same self-possessed calm with which she received everything, thanked them for coming, offered them coffee if they had the time, and did not appear to notice the way they stared at her with something between gratitude and bewilderment. When the last family left, she closed the front door and turned to find Joseph standing at the end of the hallway. "You did not have to do that," he said. She looked at him. "They have children, I already told you." "Miss Monroe," he said and stopped. She waited. "I want to tell you something," he said. He was not a man who found this kind of speech comfortable. He found it, in fact, actively uncomfortable, in the way that people who have spent a long time in silence find the act of voicing things uncomfortable. Not because they don't feel them, but because giving them voice makes them real in a way that can't be undone. What you did for the Hatchers, what you did in that study, on the floor with those papers, I am aware that it went considerably beyond the scope of your employment. She was watching him very carefully. "I want you to know that I see it," he said. "What kind of person it takes to care about something that is not technically your problem." He looked at her. "I know what it is to feel that things are beyond your reach to fix. I have lived in that." He stopped again, tried again. "I don't take it for granted, that's all." The expression on her face had shifted into something quieter, something less armored than her usual composure. "Thank you," she said, simply, without decoration. "That means something." They stood in the hallway for a moment that stretched a beat longer than ordinary conversation required, and then Mrs. Abrams appeared from the kitchen to announce that supper was ready, and they moved apart and went into the dining room, and neither of them said anything more about it. But at supper that evening, for the second time, Joseph Turner smiled. This time it was at something Dick said about the North Herd, something mildly absurd about a particular longhorn's persistent refusal to cooperate with any kind of routine, and the smile was easier than the first one had been, less startled, more genuine. And when he looked up from it, he found Wilhelmina looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, something warm and wondering and briefly unguarded. She looked away first. December came in with weather that was serious about it, a sustained cold that frosted the window panes every morning and sent the temperature below 0 at night. The cattle work intensified. The hands were out for long hours managing the herd through the cold, breaking ice in the water troughs before dawn, carrying supplemental hay to the south pasture, where the grass had gone hard under the frost. Joseph came in from these days cold through to the bone and found the ranch house warm, always warm, because Wilhelmina had quietly taken on the domestic management alongside the accounts, not as an extension of her duties, but simply as something that needed doing, working alongside Mrs. Abrams in a partnership that the housekeeper, initially skeptical, had come to value clearly. There was always food. There was always coffee. The supply inventory was impeccably managed. She had reorganized the whole system within the first month and eliminated what turned out to be a significant ongoing waste in the household stores. She also, Joseph discovered, read in the evenings. He would come through the parlor late in the evening after checking with Pete about the next day's work and find her in the chair nearest the lamp with a book. And she would look up and say something brief and then look back down. And there was nothing in this that required any response, no social performance, just two people in the same warm room at the end of a cold day. And it was the most peaceful thing Joseph had experienced in 4 years. He began staying in the parlor in the evenings. He told himself it was because the study was cold after the fire went down. One evening in the second week of December, he came in to find her with a letter in her hand rather than a book, and her face had a quality to it that was not her usual composure. Not distress exactly, but something adjacent, a careful containing of something that wanted to be larger. He sat down across from her. Bad news. She looked up, and her expression made its usual quick adjustment toward control, but not quickly enough that he didn't see beneath it. "My cousin in Cincinnati," she said. "She's to be married in February. She stopped. I am glad for her. It's only that she was the last of the family I was close to, and her life will naturally move in a different direction now." He understood what she was not saying. She was not saying she was lonely. She was not saying that this new professional life, however competent she was making it, had exacted a cost she had not fully calculated. She was not saying any of those things because she was Wilhelmina Monroe, and she did not say things like that without a great deal of provocation. "My wife's family," he said before he had entirely decided to say it, "stopped writing to me after Clara died." He paused. "I understood it. They were grieving. They could not see me without seeing her." But it left he found the word, void. She was looking at him with complete stillness. "Clara," she said very quietly, "I have noticed the portrait." "Yes." He looked at the fire. "She died in January of 1879, fever. It was very fast." He was quiet for a moment. "I was not prepared for how much of a person's life is made up of the small habits of other people. How much of what you are day to day is made up of the specific way another person exists near you. When that is gone," he stopped. "The silence is the hardest part," Wilhelmina said, not consoling, simply acknowledging. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." They were quiet for a while together, and it was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the kind of quiet that exists between people who have said something true to each other and don't need to put more words around it. "I am sorry about your cousin," he said. "I am genuinely glad for her," Wilhelmina said, and then, with the exact honesty that he had come to expect from her and had come to value more than he had anticipated, "and also a little sad for myself. I am allowed both." "You are," he agreed. She went back to her letter. He picked up the newspaper he had not yet read. The fire crackled. Outside, the Kansas wind moved across the plains with its low and perpetual song, and inside the Turner ranch house it was warm. The crisis that came in the third week of December arrived fast, the way crises in that country always did, without sufficient warning, and at the worst possible time. Garrison had apparently decided that losing the Hatcher gambit required a response, and his response was not legal this time. It was practical and ugly. 3 of Joseph's cattle were found at the east fence line with brands that had been doctored crude, hurried alterations to the Turner mark that, if a man were looking for it or were inclined to believe it, might suggest the animals had been rebranded from Garrison's stock. It was a cattle theft accusation, the oldest and most dangerous kind of accusation in the West. Colquitt, Garrison's trail boss, had apparently been making remarks in Caldwell about missing stock. The county sheriff, a man named Dawes who was not corrupt but who was cautious in the way of men who understood that antagonizing the largest cattleman in the county was professionally inadvisable, came out to the ranch with 2 deputies on a Tuesday morning. Joseph stood in the yard with Sheriff Dawes and kept his voice completely level while explaining what he knew about the animal's provenance. He had bought those 3 steers at the fall stockyard sale in September. He had receipts. "Receipts can be produced," Dawes said, not accusingly but with the careful neutrality of a man threading a very fine needle. "Indeed they can," Wilhelmina said from the porch. Both Joseph and Dawes turned. She had her coat on and a folder of papers in her hand, and she came down the porch steps with her careful, precise tread and handed the folder to the sheriff without ceremony. "September 18th, stockyard sale, Caldwell," she said. "3 steers, lot numbers recorded, bill of sale signed by the yard agent, Mr. Carl Pettigrew. The purchase is entered in the ranch account ledger, which I can show you in its original form in the study. Additionally, the veterinary inspection record from October, Mr. Frank Loomis, who I believe you know, identifies these 3 animals by description and confirms they were present on Turner property and bearing the correct, undoctored mark as of October 9th. Which means the brand alteration occurred after October 9th, which means it was done by someone who accessed the east fence line from outside the property." She paused. "Which is adjacent to Garrison's land." Sheriff Dawes looked at the papers. He looked at them for a long time. "Miss Monroe," he said, "how long have you been here?" 6 weeks, she said. He looked at Joseph. "Your ledgers have always been this thorough." "They have been since November," Joseph said. Dawes was quiet for another long moment. Then he closed the folder and handed it back. "I'll need to speak with Carl Pettigrew," he said, "and Frank Loomis. If their accounts confirm this, then the allegation doesn't stand." He looked across toward the east fence line. "And I want to know who's been riding along that boundary." He rode back to town within the hour. Joseph watched him go and then turned to look at Wilhelmina, who was already heading back up the porch steps. "You had those papers ready," he said. "I heard riders come up the lane," she said without stopping. "I know what a sheriff's party looks like. And you had the papers." She paused at the door and looked back at him. "I have been keeping your accounts, Mr. Turner. It is my business to know what has been purchased, when, and for how much. That is not extraordinary. Most people would not have thought to bring documentation outside when a sheriff rode up." She looked at him for a moment with those direct brown eyes. "Most people have not been in a position," she said quietly, "where they understood that documentation is the only thing that stands between the truth and what someone with more power wants the truth to be." And she went inside. He stood in the cold yard for a while after that, thinking about what she had said and what it meant about the kind of life she had lived before arriving here. The supply company, the receivership, the letters she must have had to write in those months after her father died, navigating creditors and lawyers and the intricate machinery of financial dissolution. She had learned documentation as survival. She had learned it early and she had learned it thoroughly, and she had brought it with her to Kansas without fanfare and without asking to be thanked for it. And he was discovering that there was a kind of courage in that, in the quiet accumulation of practical armor, that he had not previously thought to look for or to admire. Garrison's accusation collapsed within the week. Carl Pettigrew confirmed the September sale. Frank Loomis confirmed the October inspection. Sheriff Dawes, to his credit, sent a formal letter to Garrison's holding company requesting an explanation for the presence of individuals on the Turner East fence line, which produced no response, but which put the matter on record in a way that Garrison would have difficulty moving around. Garrison made no further moves that winter. The county understood that something had shifted, that Turner Ranch had acquired a capacity for documentation and legal precision that made it a more complicated target than it had previously been. The smaller homesteaders in the south part of the county began bringing their own papers and records to Wilhelmina for advice, quietly, one at a time, on Sunday afternoons, and she looked at each situation with the same methodical care. Joseph watched this happen and found himself adjusting a picture he had held of the ranch, of his life on it, without fully realizing the adjustment was occurring. It was Christmas Eve when things broke open between them. The weather had been brutal all week, a blizzard that came in from the northwest and didn't move, pinning the ranch under a foot of snow and dropping the temperature to levels that were genuinely dangerous. The hands had worked 2 days straight bringing the herd in close, managing the animals through the cold, losing 2 older cattle to the conditions, which could not be helped. By Christmas Eve the worst was technically past, but the cold had not lifted, and the sky was the flat white of weather that was not finished. Mrs. Abrams had gone to her sister's place in Caldwell for the holiday. Joseph had insisted. Pete Caldwell and the hands had the bunkhouse. It was only Joseph and Wilhelmina in the main house. She had made supper. Real supper, not the functional weekday meals she had spent the afternoon cooking, and the house smelled of it, of roasted meat and spiced apple from a recipe she had mentioned was her mother's. She had found somewhere a candle for the table and a sprig of juniper in a glass. Joseph came in from the evening check, took off his coat and his snow-covered boots, and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at what she had done. She was at the stove, and she turned when she heard him. Her hair was slightly disordered from the day's work, which was unusual for her, and she had color in her face from the heat of the kitchen, and she looked in that moment more herself than he had ever seen her, not the composed, precise person she presented to the world, but someone warmer and more vulnerable and more real. "Sit down," she said. "It's ready." They ate across from each other at the table where she had placed the candle and the juniper, and the conversation moved in a way that supper conversations between them sometimes did by now, through the ranch, through the season, through small things that had accumulated enough familiarity to be comfortable material. But there was something different in the quality of the evening, something in the Christmas Eve darkness outside and the warmth inside, and the fact that it was just the two of them, that made the conversation gradually deepen past its usual working boundaries. She told him about a Christmas when she was perhaps 12, when her father had given her a set of accountancy ledgers as a gift, real ones, the kind used in business, because she had been following him around the office for months asking questions about the accounts. Most fathers, she said, would have told a 12-year-old girl to go learn needlework. Hers had looked at her across his desk and said, "All right, if you want to know how it works, I'll teach you how it works." "He sounds like he was a good man," Joseph said. "He was a very good man," she said quietly. "An impractical one sometimes. His heart was too large for his business sense, and the supply company always operated on a narrower margin than it should have because he couldn't bring himself to charge what the market would actually bear if he thought a customer was struggling." She was looking at the candle. "The creditors didn't care about that." "No," he said, "they wouldn't." She looked up at him. "You know what I have thought about since coming here." "Since what happened with the Hatchers?" "Tell me," he said. "I have thought about what it would have meant for my father's supply customers," she said. "If someone had helped them the way—" She stopped and shook her head slightly. "He used to extend credit to farmers who couldn't make their supply payments, sometimes for months. And then when the company went under, those debts were called in by the creditors, and I know for a fact that at least 3 of those families lost their operations as a result." She was quiet for a moment. "If someone had found the weak joint in the creditor's mechanism the way I found it in Garrison's—" "You can't carry that," Joseph said. She looked at him. "Your father's customers," he said. "That is not yours to carry." He met her eyes. "You were 25 years old and you had just lost your father and your livelihood in the same month. There is a limit to what one person can be responsible for." She was looking at him with an expression that was doing something very complex, moving through several layers very quickly, something he had not seen from her before. "You sound," she said slowly, "like someone who has had to learn that lesson himself." He was quiet. "After Clara," he said finally, "the hands, the ranch, the contracts, the neighbors, I managed to keep all of it functioning, and I told myself that was sufficient. That it was all I owed, that the doing was enough even without the—" He looked at the candle. "I stopped sitting at that table in the parlor," he said. "The one by the window where Clara liked to sit. I told myself I was managing my time efficiently. I had a lot of work to do." "Joseph," she said. It was the first time she had used his name, not Mr. Turner, his name, and it landed with a weight he hadn't expected, the sound of it in her voice, soft and direct. "I would sit in the parlor some evenings," he said, and look at that chair and be furious. Not at her, at the fact of it, at the arbitrariness of it. She was there and then she was not there, and I had not been given any sufficient reason. And being furious at the arbitrariness of death is, he paused, entirely futile. Yes, she said, but also entirely human. He looked at her. The candlelight was in her eyes. Wilhelmina, he said, and stopped. Yes, she said very quietly. I want to tell you something that I have been not telling you for some weeks, he said. And I want to be careful about it because you are my employee, and I do not want you to feel that your position here is dependent on Joseph, she said. Tell me what you want to tell me. He looked at her across the table. I am afraid, he said. I want you to know that first. I'm afraid of this. What I find myself feeling is frightening to me in a way I don't entirely know how to navigate, because I had built a very functional life around not feeling it, around the efficiency of not feeling it. He stopped. But I find that he stopped again, tried the third time. I find that I want you to stay, not as my bookkeeper. I mean, I want you to stay. The silence that followed was very long. She was looking at him with that look that he had seen briefly at supper weeks ago and not been able to name, warm and wondering and unguarded. But now it was completely unguarded, completely open, and he could see in it something that he recognized, not as a mirror image of his own feeling, but as its companion, its answer. I should tell you, she said, that I arrived here as a professional and with every intention of remaining one. She folded her hands on the table. And that intention has been thoroughly complicated over the past 6 weeks. Complicated how? He said. You are a decent man, she said. That sounds simple. It is not simple. I have met very few truly decent men. And you are interesting, and you are not afraid of me, which most men are. And I find that I think about you. She stopped. Considerably. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked at his hand and then at his face, and her expression was open in a way that he thought, from what he knew of her by now, she had not been open with anyone for a very long time. I'm not asking anything of you tonight, he said. I only want you to know that I see you, all of you. The competence and the care and he smiled, and it was a full smile, unhurried and without ambiguity, the fearlessness. I see all of it. She turned her hand over under his so that their palms met and her fingers curled around his fingers. I see you too, she said. The grief and the stubbornness and the fundamental, the corner of her mouth curved, inability to accept help gracefully. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in longer than he could precisely account for, and the sound of it surprised them both. And then she was smiling too, a real smile, as open and unguarded as her face had been a moment ago, and it changed her entirely, the way a window changes when the light shifts through it, and he thought that this was possibly the most important thing he had seen all year. They did not rush. They were, both of them, people who had learned caution, but they sat at that table until the candle burned low, and they talked about her father and his wife, about the ranch and its future, about the strange and improbable chain of events that had brought a letter from a woman in St. Louis to a man in Kansas who had not smiled on a Sunday in 4 years, and by the time they said good night and went to their separate rooms, something had settled between them that had the quality of a thing decided. He asked her formally in January. He was not a demonstrative man by nature, but he had thought about how to do it and had decided that she deserved something deliberate. He had ridden into Caldwell and called on the jeweler there, a man named Bauer, and had found a ring that he thought she would accept, not ornate, nothing that would make her feel like a display, but a good ring, a serious one, a gold band with a small channel-set garnet, and he had brought it back and kept it in his desk drawer for 4 days while he worked out what to say. On a Saturday evening in January, when the supper dishes were cleared and Mrs. Abrams had retired and the house was quiet, he came into the parlor where she was reading and stood until she looked up. I have been trying, he said, to think of the most accurate way to say this. She closed her book. You have been here 11 weeks, he said. In those 11 weeks you have brought this ranch a standard of care that I did not know it was possible to achieve. You have defended my neighbors from a man who was confident that power made him untouchable. You have organized my accounts so thoroughly that I could read them in the dark. You have sat across from me every evening at supper and made me aware that I have been living in a very narrow section of my own life for a very long time. He looked at her. And I would like if you are willing to live in a wider one, with you as my wife. He held out the ring. Wilhelmina Monroe looked at the ring, and then at him with an expression that he had learned to read by now, that movement through layers, the careful checking of things, the assessment that was not coldness but simply the habit of a person who had learned not to accept things without examining them first. He let her look. He was not afraid of her looking. You understand, she said, that I will not stop working. The ranch needs a bookkeeper, he said. You are the best one I've met. Her mouth curved. And you understand that I have opinions. I had noticed, he said, and that I intend to keep helping the families in the south part of the county when they need it. I would expect nothing less. She looked at him steadily. And you are doing this because you love me, she said, not coy, direct. Not because it is practical or convenient or because you feel responsible for me, because you love me. Wilhelmina, he said, I have been in love with you since you sat across from me at supper and told me I was staring at you as though you had grown a second head. She stood up. She took the ring from his hand and looked at it, and then she looked at him, and what he saw on her face was not complicated at all, not layered, not armored. It was very simple and very true. Yes, she said, I will. He put the ring on her finger and she stepped into him and he held her, the way he had not held anyone in 4 years, and she put her head against his shoulder and they stood in the warm parlor while the January wind moved outside across the Kansas plain. I love you, she said into the fabric of his shirt. I know, he said. I know you do. He pressed his face into her hair. I love you too, enormously. She gave a small, startled laugh at the word. Enormously, she repeated. It seemed accurate, he said. They were married in March of 1884. The ceremony was at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, which was small enough to make any event feel intimate and large enough, barely, to hold the number of people who came. James Hatcher was there with his wife and children. Pete Caldwell was Joseph's best man, which made the old foreman so visibly uncomfortable with the honor, and so visibly moved by it, that the hand spent the week afterward mercilessly teasing him about crying during the ceremony, which he denied with complete transparency. Wilhelmina wore a dress she had made herself over the preceding 6 weeks, deep blue wool with a white collar, practical and beautiful, exactly like everything she did. She came down the center aisle of the church on her own because there was no one to give her away, and she came with the straight-back, deliberate step of a person who had learned to proceed without relying on the support of others. And when she reached Joseph at the front of the church and looked at him, he was already smiling. The preacher, Reverend Coles, was a practical man of middle age who delivered a ceremony that was solemn and brief in the best possible proportion. Joseph said the words without looking away from her face. Wilhelmina said them back in a clear, steady voice that carried to the back of the church. When it was done and they walked back down the aisle together into the March sunlight, Joseph kept her hand in his and did not let go. The supper that followed at the ranch house, prepared by Mrs. Abrams with contributions from Mrs. Hatcher and 3 other women from the county, was large and warm and loud, the kind of gathering that Turner Ranch had not seen in 4 years. Pete Caldwell made a toast that was incoherent with emotion and entirely sincere. Dix broke a plate and apologized so excessively that everyone laughed. The children of the Hatcher family ran through the house with the cheerful, destructive energy of children who have been told to be careful. Joseph stood near the fireplace at one point, holding a cup of coffee, watching Wilhelmina on the other side of the room, talking to Mrs. Hatcher with her hands moving expressively in a way she only did when she was genuinely engaged, and he felt something so large and uncomplicated in his chest that he had to put the coffee down for a moment. Pete appeared at his elbow. "You look like a man who's been handed something he didn't know to ask for," he said. "That is remarkably accurate," Joseph said. The old foreman looked at Wilhelmina, and then at Joseph, with the assessing eye of a man who has worked beside someone for long enough to know when they have come back from somewhere. Clara would have liked her, he said. I want to say that if it's all right. It's all right, Joseph said, and yes, she would have. The spring of 1884 was the best season Turner Ranch had seen in several years. The herd came through the winter better than the previous two. The cattle prices in Abilene rose, and the railroad contract was renewed with improved terms. Improved in part because Wilhelmina had reviewed the previous contract's language and identified two provisions that had been consistently disadvantageous and renegotiated them by correspondence with the railroad's regional manager. A process that the man had initially treated with considerable skepticism and subsequently treated with considerably more respect. Garrison was not gone from the county. He was not the kind of man who went away, but something had shifted in the balance of things. The homesteaders were more organized than they had been, coordinating through informal networks in ways that Garrison's previous methods of isolated pressure were less effective against. 3 of them had consolidated their water access through a formal county water rights agreement that Wilhelmina had helped draft. The legal exposure that the failed cattle theft accusation had created meant that Garrison's direct approaches to Turner property had effectively ceased. He would find other methods eventually. The county understood this, but eventually was not now, and now was good. On a warm evening in May, Wilhelmina sat down at the study desk, which was now entirely hers by mutual agreement. Joseph had moved his working papers to the parlor table and found he preferred it and looked across at him where he was writing correspondence. I want to tell you something, she said. He looked up. She was looking at him with an expression that was warm and careful and entirely specific. We are going to have a child, she said. The room was very quiet. Joseph put down his pen. Are you, he started. I am entirely certain, she said. I have been certain for approximately 3 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I told you. He stood up and crossed the room and knelt beside her chair and took her face in his hands and looked at her. She was watching him with that open expression, the unguarded one, ready to receive whatever he was feeling. What he was feeling was enormous. There was no other word for it. Are you well? He said. I am very well, she said. I am better than well. He kissed her then, gently and thoroughly, and when he stopped he kept his hands on her face. I am, he said. I don't have words for this. You don't need them, she said. He sat down on the floor beside her chair, which was undignified and something he would not have done in front of anyone else, and she put her hand in his hair, and they stayed like that in the spring evening while the light moved slowly across the study floor. Their son was born in December of 1884, in the first real snow of the season, with Dr. Hennessy from Caldwell in attendance and Mrs. Abrams providing the kind of calm, unflappable assistance that made her presence worth more than most people's expertise. The birth was not easy, December births rarely are, but Wilhelmina was constitutionally resistant to things that tried to defeat her, which the doctor observed afterward with a dry admiration. And by the evening of the second day, she was sitting up in bed with the baby in her arms and Joseph beside her, and the snow was coming down outside the window in soft, unhurried waves. They named him Harold. Harold Monroe Turner, for her father, which she had requested with quiet directness in the early days of the pregnancy, and which Joseph had agreed to without hesitation, because the man who had taught a 12-year-old girl that she was worth teaching deserved to be remembered. Harold was a large, red-faced, alarmingly vocal infant who made his opinions about the world known with a directness that his mother said she recognized. He grew quickly. He had Wilhelmina's dark brown eyes and his father's jaw, and a general air of settled determination that visitors to the ranch found both charming and slightly exhausting in a very small person. Garrison left the county in the autumn of 1885. He did not announce it, and there was no ceremony to it. He simply sold his operation to a consortium from Chicago, took what must have been a very large sum, and departed for somewhere east. The word that came through the county by the usual channels was that the national cattle market was becoming unfavorable for operations of his scale, that the big ranchers were facing increasing pressure from the railroad and from the homesteader movements, and from the growing political organization of the farming interest in Washington, and that a man of Garrison's profile had decided to take his money and find easier ground. Pete Caldwell brought Joseph this news on a Saturday morning in October, and Joseph listened and then nodded once and went back to the fence he was repairing. Pete watched him for a moment. "You don't seem especially moved," he said. "I'm satisfied," Joseph said. Being moved by it would require me to have thought about him more than he deserved. He went home that evening and told Wilhelmina, who was in the study with Harold crawling determinedly across the floor under the desk, and she listened and was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said, and then, looking down at Harold, "Your father is a very wise man, and you should take note of that." Harold grabbed the desk leg and pulled himself to standing, which was a new and very recent achievement, and looked at them both with profound self-satisfaction. Joseph picked him up, and Harold attempted to eat his father's collar with complete commitment. "He has your approach to problems," Wilhelmina said. "He has your tenacity," Joseph said. "He has our stubbornness," she said, with a smile that still, 2 years into seeing it regularly, made him feel exactly the way it had on Christmas Eve across the table with the candle between them. In the years that followed, Turner Ranch grew. Not extravagantly, not beyond what the land and the market could sustain. Wilhelmina's management of the accounts was too clear-eyed for extravagance, but steadily, with the compounding returns of good practice and careful management. The herd reached 4,000 head in 1886. The ranch added a second barn in 1887, built to a design that Joseph had drafted and Wilhelmina had reviewed for structural and material cost efficiency. The railroad contract expanded to cover 2 buyers rather than 1. In 1887, they had a second child. A daughter this time, born in the spring, who arrived faster and louder than her brother and seemed from the first moment of her existence to have a powerful objection to any suggestion that the world had not been arranged specifically for her convenience. They named her Clara because it was time, because Joseph was ready, and because Wilhelmina, who understood what it meant to him without requiring an explanation, had said simply, "It's a beautiful name." Clara grew up loud and confident, and devoted to her older brother in the way of children who have sensed from infancy that their household is a fundamentally stable one, a place where the foundation holds. Harold grew up quieter, thoughtful, with his mother's quality of attention. He heard everything, absorbed everything, and made his assessments with a patience that the other ranch hands' children found mysterious and his parents found entirely recognizable. On a Sunday evening in the autumn of 1888, 5 years after Wilhelmina had arrived on the Caldwell stage with a leather case and a letter of acceptance in her pocket, Joseph Turner sat at the head of his supper table and looked around it. Pete Caldwell was there, as he always was for Sunday suppers, because Mrs. Abrams had simply begun setting a place for him years ago, and no one had suggested it be otherwise. Mrs. Abrams herself sat at the table now on Sundays, because Wilhelmina had at some point made clear that a person who had managed this household for 6 years was a member of it and should be treated accordingly, and no one had argued the point. Dix was there, grown from a boy of 19 to a young man of 24 who had become Joseph's most trusted hand, with the slightly overwhelmed look of someone who has been invited to Sunday supper in the main house and is still not entirely sure what he has done to deserve it. Harold was at the table, 5 years old, eating with the serious focus of a person for whom food is a professional undertaking. Clara, 3½, was in the high chair that Pete had built for her, making aggressive negotiations with her vegetables. Wilhelmina was at the other end of the table from Joseph. She was talking to Mrs. Abrams about something. He could hear the words from where he sat but was not following them. The lamp above the table sent warm light across her face, across her hands, across the dark hair that she still wore simply and practically, across the small gold band in its garnet that had been on her finger for 4.5 years, and that he still looked at sometimes, quietly, in the way of a person confirming something that still produces a feeling. She glanced up and caught him looking at her. Her expression moved through its familiar opening, that small, unhurried shift from composure to warmth, and she gave him a look that was entirely private in a room full of people. A look that said everything it needed to say about what they were to each other, about the particular form of knowing that develops between two people who have chosen each other with clear eyes and kept choosing each other through the ordinary ongoing work of a life shared. He smiled at her. It was not a small smile, and it was not involuntary, and it was not quickly swallowed. It was the full, open smile of a man who has remembered, after a long absence, how to mean it. She smiled back. And then Clara threw a piece of carrot across the table and struck Pete Caldwell directly in the center of his forehead. And the room erupted in the particular chaos of a household that has enough love in it to absorb disruption without damage. And Joseph Turner sat at the head of his table and laughed from somewhere entirely genuine and was grateful. In a way he did not try to find words for every single thing that had brought him to this exact moment. Later, when the children were in bed and Pete and Dix had gone back to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Abrams had retired, Joseph and Wilhelmina sat in the parlor in the lamplight as they had sat every evening for 5 years, and it was ordinary and warm and exactly right. "I have been thinking," she said, not looking up from the account she was reviewing. "Dangerous," he said. She made a brief sound that was his favorite of her sounds, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, a small exhale of amusement that she still produced only when she was not monitoring herself. "The Draper property," she said. "Young Miles Draper has been struggling. His father passed last spring, you know that. The land is not producing well under his management." "I know," he said. "He might be open to a partnership arrangement," she said. "Not a sale. A working arrangement where we provide management support for the East acreage in exchange for water rights formalization and a share of the output." Joseph looked at her. "You've been working this out." "I've been thinking about it," she said precisely, which in her language meant yes. "It would strengthen our East line," he said, "and it would keep Miles Draper on his land rather than losing it." "Yes," she said, "both of those things." He looked at the fire for a moment. "All right," he said, "put the figures together and let's look at it." She nodded, making a note. Then she put the accounts down and looked at him across the parlor with an expression that had nothing to do with accounts. "Joseph," she said. He looked at her. "We are going to need a larger study," she said. He blinked. We are going to have another child," she said. The third time she told him this, he did not need to find words. He crossed the room and pulled her to her feet and held her against him, and she put her arms around him, and they stood in the warm parlor that had once been the room with the empty chair, and it was full now. The whole house was full, in every way that mattered. "A larger study," he confirmed, into her hair. She laughed against his chest. "And a third bedroom. Pete will be insufferable about building something again," he said. "Pete will be overjoyed," she said. "He will tell everyone in Caldwell. He will tell everyone in Caldwell before we've finished breakfast." "Yes," she said, still laughing softly. "He absolutely will." He held her and she held him in the house on the Kansas plain, in the warm, ordinary evening of their shared life. And outside the autumn wind moved across the wide, dark land as it always had and always would. And inside it was the kind of quiet that exists only between people who have found each other. Not accidentally, not without cost, but truly with the full weight of what they each were and had been, and chosen, deliberately and with clear eyes, to stay. The third child arrived the following June, another boy, large and placid where Clara was stormy, and where Harold was precise, with his grandfather Joseph's wide frame and his grandmother Monroe's dark eyes, according to Pete Caldwell, who said this with the absolute confidence of a man who had no business making genealogical assessments but could not be stopped from making them. They named him James, after James Hatcher, because Wilhelmina believed in naming things for the right reasons, and because the Hatchers were still on their land, still farming it, still making their payments, still sending their children past the creek line to school in Caldwell, and because sometimes the right reasons are simply the ones that are true. Turner Ranch at the end of 1889 was a different place than it had been at the end of 1883. It was larger in acreage, more diverse in operation. The partnership with young Miles Draper had worked exactly as Wilhelmina had projected, and its accounts were in the most precise and comprehensible order of any cattle operation in the county, a fact that the bank in Caldwell and the railroad buyers in Abilene had all noted with varying degrees of admiration and commercial interest. But the most significant change was not in the numbers. The most significant change was in the quality of the life that existed within the property's boundaries. A household that had operated for 4 years as a highly functional mechanism for the management of grief had become something else. It had become a home, a full one with the particular complexity and warmth of a place where multiple people are genuinely glad to be in it. Harold Turner, at 6, had already decided he was going to be a rancher, a decision he had communicated to his parents with the same unshakable conviction with which his mother approached a ledger problem. Clara Turner, at 4.5, had not decided anything except that the world was substantially more interesting than anyone had given her credit for, and she intended to investigate all of it. James Turner, at 7 months, had decided that Pete Caldwell was the funniest person on the property, a judgment he expressed by laughing exclusively and extravagantly at everything Pete said, which had made Pete Caldwell arguably the happiest man in Sumner County. On a Sunday in December of 1889, in the first hard frost of the winter season, Joseph Turner sat at the head of his supper table. The table was bigger now than it had been. Pete had extended it that summer to accommodate the household that kept growing. The good china was out, and the candles, and the embroidered tablecloth that had once been put away and was now always on the table on Sundays because it was right that it should be. Harold sat on his left. Clara sat on his right because she had negotiated this position with a thoroughness that impressed him every time he thought about it. James was in Mrs. Abraham's patient arms at the end of the table, chewing on a piece of bread with the focused dedication of a very small person with an important job. And Wilhelmina sat across from him. She was talking to Pete about the spring herd plan, and she was using her hands the way she did when she was engaged and not monitoring herself. And the lamplight was in her eyes, and she had flour on the cuff of her sleeve from the bread she had made that morning, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman entirely, precisely, fully in her own life in the place she belonged. She stopped mid-sentence and looked at him. He was already smiling. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" he said. "Looking at me. I am looking at my wife," he said, "at my table on a Sunday evening. I don't believe that requires a defense." Pete Caldwell stared extremely intently at his plate. Mrs. Abraham smiled at something on the wall. Harold looked between his parents with the analytical gaze of a 6-year-old trying to determine what was happening. Clara said, "Papa, your potatoes are getting cold," which was both accurate and entirely beside the point. Wilhelmina looked at Joseph across the biscuits and the gravy and the roasted corn and the bread she had made and the good china and the candles and the embroidered tablecloth and all the accumulated ordinary extraordinary evidence of the life they had built together. And she smiled at him with her whole face, open and warm and precisely herself. "They really are getting cold," she said. "Worth it," he said. And the table around them moved in the way of full and living tables, with voices and small interruptions and the sound of a baby laughing at Pete Caldwell for no discernible reason. And the Kansas winter moved quietly outside against the windows. And inside the house was warm and lit, and full of the kind of love that does not announce itself, but simply exists, steadily and without condition, in the way of things that are finally, after everything, exactly where they are meant to be.